Welcome back to the 2021 Brooklyn Antiquarian Book Fair virtual edition. I'm your host, Brian Chittister, and we hope to have the fair back to its regular location next year at the Expo Center in Greenpoint here in Brooklyn. But for now, we're really happy to be able to make all the presentations available on the internet. And so if you haven't already visited the fair, it runs from September 23rd to the 26th, and all the virtual booths and other content, including all of these seminars, can be found at brooklynbookfair.com. And I'm really excited to introduce our next guest, Tony Kail, who will give his presentation today as a slideshow. And I'll turn it over to Tony in just a minute here, but first I wanted to introduce him a little bit. So I have some notes here, and he is an author, researcher, and college lecturer / professor whose main subject of interest is rootwork, or hoodoo, as it is commonly known in the Black American tradition. Tony wrote the book, The Secret History of Memphishoodoo, which I have here. Fantastic book, and Stories of Root Workers and Hoodoo in the Mid-South, which was given the endorsement of author Preston Lauterbach, who's an amazing scholar on Beale Street and Southern R&B and blues. He wrote the book, The Chitlin Circuit, and many other subjects concerning Black American culture and business and whatnot. So Tony definitely comes with great accolades, and we're really excited. He's coming to us from Jackson, Tennessee. And again, I'm really thrilled and honored to have him here. So without further ado, take it away, Tony.
Thank you so much, Brian. It's a pleasure to be here. And I just want to share a little bit with viewers this morning about some of the things that we found doing research for the book, and things that just sort of revealed themselves as we were doing. So, well, I want to share a little bit this morning about Memphis hoodoo history. You know, Memphis is a city of deep history, deep cultural history, and amazing diversity. And, you know, growing up as a child in Memphis, we would hear of things like hoodoo, we would hear of things like root work, but it was something that we really didn't comprehend because we weren't born into the community that practiced this. But we would find out years later about a number of things in Memphis. When we look at the historical beginnings of root work and the arrival of root work in African traditional healing systems coming into Memphis, historically, we saw that back in the 1500s, DeSoto brought Africans as slaves across the Mississippi and brought them to Memphis. Later on, we would see the building of Fort Assumption, where there would be more African influence as people were taken from their homes and stripped away and brought to this new world. In the 1700s, we started seeing Africans brought as slaves from areas like Virginia and North Carolina. And this is important to note because they picked up different cultural nuances in the healing cultures from these areas and brought them as well. And by 1791, there was a census done showing that we had at least 3,000 African men, women, and children in the Memphis area. When we use the terms hoodoo, or root work, and conjure, these terms a lot of times refer to what has been called the secret institution. And the secret institution is this phenomena of where traditional healers, those who retain the mysteries and the secrets of healing and ultimately survival, would use these on plantations throughout the South. And so if a family was living in horrible conditions and were undergoing extreme violence and abuse by slave owners, medicine was very limited. And so there would be those practitioners, those traditional healers who knew exactly what kind of root or what kind of bark to use to bring about healing, and in some cases, spiritual healing and protection as well. The depth of history relating to traditional healing and traditional spirituality in Memphis has a lot to do with survival amidst slavery, survival amidst segregation, and race became a very big issue because from the moment that African traditions got onto the ground in Memphis, there was this constant animosity from the white community that Africans and African Americans were doing some sort of malevolent voodoo, and it wasn't the religion voodoo. It was said in this pejorative kind of manner. What was interesting, starting back in 1868, there were situations like this where in South Memphis, there was a place called Grady's Dance Hall. It was actually had a pool hall in it. And a family owned this hall, and African Americans were welcome into the hall. And this infuriated a lot of the local white community. In fact, this place was one of the first places attacked during what we call the Memphis Massacre, a horrendous experience that occurred in Memphis. The lady who ran the establishment, a lady named Mary Grady, she fell in love with an African-American taxi cab driver named Jim Rucker. And they carried on this secret relationship. Grady was married. And of course, it was severely taboo for there to be any sort of race mingling in the public eye during this time. So Rucker became very nervous because there were threats of violence, and he knew that if they were discovered, he could potentially be killed. So he decides to leave Mary Grady, and Grady goes and consults the terms that the press used, a fetish worker, which was a common term used, a European term used to reflect sort of this exoticness of a traditional healer. And so this particular fetish worker said, there's a woman named Isabella Walton, and she is responsible for breaking up your relationship. And so Mary Grady actually goes and locates Isabella Walton and shoots her because she felt like there was a threat there. And now, you know, Walton lived. However, the astoundingness of all of this was not that a woman had been shot. The local community, their issue was because there had been an interracial romance. That was seen as a bigger deal than this. And again, we'll see race as a common theme through the history of hoodoo in Memphis. Now, one of the things that constantly ran in the local papers was this campaign of fear. There was this fear that Memphis was going to become a little New Orleans. And of course, the press and propaganda at the time was saying that, you know, Africans were stealing little white babies and taking them from their homes, and that this religion called voodoo was this sinister, you know, demonic practice. And so that continued to build the fear in Memphis. These are some of the images that could be found not only domestically but internationally, of images of this, you know, horrible human sacrifices and all of these things, basically painting this horrid picture of African traditional systems. The fear became so bad of conjurers and those who did any sort of traditional healing or traditional spiritual work that it became acceptable in some communities to not only assault, but in some cases murder those who practice these. In August of 1872, there was a man named Ruth Harrison who was blamed for a man's crops not growing. And the incident ended up resulting in over 200 men assaulting and murdering Ruth Harrison because there was fear that he had done conjure on his next door neighbor. We started seeing a campaign of police raids on practitioners. There were various settlements throughout Memphis where African Americans had been placed in various communities along areas like the Bayou Gayoso. There were these horrible names that you would find that the press would assign to these places, like Satan's Promenade and Rotten Row. And we know that by records we had seen starting in 1869, the 2nd District Police began raids on root workers and conjurers. And there's record where they would confiscate and destroy hoodoo-related materials. These are just a few of the headlines that it was not uncommon to see. Voodooism called a plain racket by warring Tennessee police, police jailing practitioners, the use of the term fetish. And so this campaign was, very, very real and very much affected the culture of African traditional healing systems in Memphis. There were incidents in which various curios were taken. And as we speak of Beale Street, this is under Beale Street. This is under the shop A. Schwab, which is one of the oldest businesses in Memphis that's still around. And under Beale Street, there actually were areas where A. Schwab kept some of the dried herbs that they would sell for root workers. And Beale Street itself plays such an important part in Memphis hoodoo history. Robert Church, the gentleman in the middle there, was the South's first African-American millionaire. And Church established Beale Street to be the avenue for Black America. He saw that there were very few places for food, for entertainment, for any sort of area where African-American families could enjoy themselves and it not be a segregated atmosphere. And so with Beale Street, we started to see also a number of shops and practitioners show up on Beale Street. It's interesting, one of the famed civil rights activists out of Memphis, Lieutenant George Washington Lee, or Lieutenant as they'd call him, wrote in his book, Beale Street, Where the Blues Began, about an incident involving a group known as the Gold Hunters cult. It was common local lore that gold hunters would come off the Mississippi River and go on to Beale Street, and they would seek out spiritual healers and spiritual readers, and they would ask them to perform specific rites and rituals. In fact, there was one case where a local reader known as Dr. Scissors was called upon to go and divine where they could find treasure along the Mississippi River. Allegedly, his working, he couldn't keep the men in the gold hunters party quiet. And so he said that he never could make a spirit manifest to give them information where this treasure was at. And since the treasure hunting party had already paid him, they ended up taking him to court. And he walks in, and there's everything from divining rods to different things of dried herbs and things that are brought into court. So it was a fascinating example, but it was only one of many examples of where we saw in Memphis hoodoo history the use of traditional spirituality used to hunt treasure. We saw in other incidents in Memphis and in Shelby County where this occurred as well in the 1875 and then later in 1954. And you would see Later on, as European spell books would show up at spiritual supply stores along Beale, they would start incorporating aspects of European ceremonial magic taken from books like the 6th and 7th books of Moses and the Lesser Key of Solomon. And they would you would start seeing some of this incorporated into traditional African practices. Spiritual workers in Memphis were both feared and respected. Many times they operated out of their residences. Elliot Schwab with A. Schwab on Beale shared with me, every neighborhood had somebody. The one lady down the hall or the one apartment you could go to, and there would be someone that would pray for you, that would lay hands on you, that knew exactly which herbal remedy to concoct if your child was sick. And many of these were referred to with familial titles such as, Uncle Dub or Mother Jones. And a lot of these practitioners had out-of-town clients who would come into Memphis and seek out these spiritual workers. Excuse me one second. On Beale Street, one of the things that Beale is historically known for is its blues music. And the sound of hoodoo could be heard in blues music on Beale. And it's interesting, we have a number of these legendary blues artists, from Memphis Minnie to Furry Lewis to people like Muddy Waters that would come and play on Beale. And they would sing about hoodoo and hoodoo practices. The interesting thing, and I always compare this with, in the 1980s, we saw a number of heavy metal bands that would include references to different esoteric practices. And it was very much a sales gimmick. As opposed to that, when we would hear about hoodoo on Beale, it was reflecting the culture. It was reflecting what was important. It was reflecting daily life of needing the power of an herb or needing spiritual protection to do a certain task. So it's very interesting. Within this, it also communicated things and people who were important in the community. You would have someone like a blues musician, Johnny Temple, and he's saying about a hoodoo woman. And he says that, yes, I went out on the mountain and I looked over Jerusalem. Well, I see them hoodoo women, oh Lord, making up in their low-down tent. Well, I'm going to Newport to see Aunt Carolyn die. Now, Aunt Carolyn Dye is a very, very important figure in the Mid-South hoodoo history. Aunt Carolyn Dye was a spiritual reader out of Newport, Arkansas, and Newport is about right around 70 miles outside of Memphis. And Aunt Carolyn had such a following that she would have people come from all over the United States to receive healings at her residence. And there were many in the Memphis community that would go see Aunt Caroline. They would go see her for spiritual readings. You would hear of incidents where someone, say, lost a wedding ring, and they would go to see her. Back in 1909, the police actually called Aunt Caroline to help them identify an assailant on a case spiritually. And it was interesting. There was such a flow of interest in Aunt Caroline and her work that you had a train that would come out of Memphis that you could actually buy a ticket and ask for the Aunt Caroline Dye special. And that would be the ticket to drop you off very close to her residence, where, it said that hundreds would wait in her front yard and wait to be seen by her to receive wisdom from her. And this is a little trip to Newport, and this is Aunt Caroline's tombstone. Also off of Beale Street, there was a very prolific herbalist named Dr. Lyncha Johnson. Dr. Lynch Johnson attended Dominion Herbal College in British Columbia, and he created a line of herbal remedy products. These products would include written instructions such as prayers that you could say, scripture that you should read as you take these. And he moved to Beale Street in the 1930s. These are some of Dr. Johnson's herbal remedies. And you notice he's along with his photo, he's got instructions on how to take these remedies. And it was said that hundreds of people utilized his remedies. These are actually some of the remaining herbs that the Memphis Pink Palace Museum has from Dr. Johnson. And it's wonderful that they've preserved some of these remedies. One of the things that would occur during the campaigns against practitioners is that police would arrest practitioners and charge them frequently with practicing medicine without a license. So in 1937, Dr. Johnson was arrested. It was said that he was using the mail to defraud customers. Essentially, an agent from a government agency found that there was a lady who ordered some sort of herbal remedy, and she received a different remedy than the one that she had requested. And so she went to the police that started an investigation, and a undercover agent sent a request for a specific remedy, and a similar situation occurred. So Dr. Johnson was arrested and taken to court. The newspapers at the time report that the day he was in court, 117 black and white clients appeared in court testifying of the work he did. And so Dr. Johnson had a tremendous following, a tremendous group of supporters. And sadly, Dr. Johnson later died in Collins Chapel Hospital in Memphis. One of the fascinating aspects of hoodoo history along Beale is we see some very authentic healers and practitioners and readers, and then we see stories like this. Back in 1925, the newspaper started carrying stories about a woman named Madam Mamie Hightower. Mamie Hightower was an African-American lady who went from rags to riches and started a beauty supply company called the Golden Brown Beauty Preparation Company. And she opened a beauty salon on Beale, and the newspapers would carry stories about Madam Hightower. And they would say, you know, she has the secrets to help you not only become beautiful, but to also be successful in life. In fact, at one point, Madam Hightower started having beauty contests in which the winner would win trips to Atlantic City, vehicles, diamond rings, and really built up this reputation of a very successful African-American business owner. At one point, Madam Hightower started sending out what she called Mojo luck bags, very play on the word mojo. But the Mojo luck bag was sent out to sort of incorporate some of the current spirituality and healing trends in the African-American community. Something interesting happened during this. In 1929, an African-American pharmacist receives a shipment from Golden Brown, and he also receives a letter that has some very overtly racist descriptions in it regarding African Americans. So there was this question of how could Madam Hightower do this? How could she send out something with this racial language like this? Well, the truth is she didn't. In fact, Madam Hightower turned out to be the wife of Zachary Hightower, the porter for the Golden Brown Chemical Company. The company was a false company set up by a wholesale company, and she was used as a selling gimmick and definitely had brought in enough money for the company that they had propped her image up as the face of the company. Very tragic story of utilizing traditional practices as a means of exploiting a community. We also had some very fascinating individuals along Beale, such as Professor Warren, excuse me. Professor Warren in 1939 was the vice mayor of Beale Street, and he started an institute called the War is Den. And he said that it refers to some terminology he had received when he was in India and learned various mystic sciences. Professor Warren learned candle magic, incense, and he would work with roots and herbs. Warren and his institution was frequently referred to as a cult in the newspapers. They actually did a lot of good. They raised money for people in the community. They would set up various accounts for those who had no ability to set up bank accounts. Just another one of the fascinating people of Beale linked to traditional spirituality practices. As we look along Beale Street, again, we talked a little bit about A. Schwab. A. Schwab began carrying herbs and candles and incense at one point when they saw there was such a need, and they have carried them throughout the years. One of the things that you'll notice is the use of the word curios. The word curio began being used by spiritual supply stores because you could not lay claim that a particular material or product had a specific spiritual power. You could buy a lucky candle from me, but I could not guarantee that it was going to be lucky for you. So the word curio began being used, and this was used to describe these various spiritual objects. And again, we started seeing some of the different European spell books make their way. We started seeing them combined with some of the lucky lottery and dream books. And it was interesting, as far as curios, Memphis has been home to, we know, at least 5 major curio companies throughout history. One of the things that we would see is some of the companies would take imagery from some of the popular books found in spiritual supply stores, like the Old Aunt Dinah's Policy Player's Guide, and they would use them on labels for incense and for various powders and oils. We would see some of the books like the Lewis Claremont's 7 Keys to Power, and there would be incense produced with some of the elements of the 7 Keys to Power. This is an old price list from one of the local curio companies there in Memphis, and you can see they carried traditional roots like High John the Conqueror root and various forms of incense and powder. The price list actually came from one of the curio companies, the American Chemical Manufacturing Company. And we would find these companies primarily selling cosmetics, but then they also adapted some of the curios that they would sell. Companies like the Keystone Laboratories that was started in the 1920s. And we would also see hi-hat products come off of that, and Curio Products Company come out of Keystone as well. And this is some of the Curio product labels that you would find, and you would see things like hot foot powder. One of the things that we saw that was very interesting is somewhere in the history of the products, the focus moved from imagery relating to Africa and African Americans to the white community. So you would see images of, say, where you would see an image of John the Conqueror, who in the lore regarding John the Conqueror, he's an African prince. But then all of a sudden you would see imagery of a white European king representing John the Conqueror on some of the labels. So it sort of communicated some of the changes in the customer base, not only that was buying in some cases, but that who the companies were trying to sell to. Lucky Heart Cosmetics started in Memphis, and they one of their first products during World War II was selling Dustro foot powder. The military started ordering it like crazy from them. They started selling cosmetics and then later Curios. They got to one point where they were doing more than 1,000 orders a day, and the post office in Memphis told them they were the third largest partial post mailer in the city. One of the things that Lucky Heart did was they would employ door-to-door sales agents. And so you would see ads like this where you could actually become an employee of Lucky Heart and be a salesperson, and they would sell cosmetics as well as the Curios. A fascinating aspect of this is at one point, one of the bishops out of the Memphis-based Church of God in Christ, Bishop McEwen, actually became a sales agent for Lucky Heart and would take many of their products to church conventions and sell them. And so this was an interesting aspect where you would see these two particular cultures together. These are some of the different ads for some of the Curios. You can see they carried what they called genuine New Orleans Van oil, which was a very popular oil, particularly around Algiers in Louisiana. And you can see some of the different imagery there. Lucky Heart had a fascinating offer where they would say that they'd give anyone $1,000 if you could prove that their products were not genuine Curios. Well, as you can see, they're genuine Curios. There's no way around that. So, but the marketing of these products was amazing. The impact of Lucky Heart was very wide. We found it mentioned in different periodicals, such as the 1940 book Drum and Shadows out of Georgia, where it was mentioned in one part a Lucky Heart salesman had come along selling Curios. It was also mentioned in Harry Middleton Hyatt's landmark stuff, Hoodoo, Conjuration, Witchcraft, and Rootwork. So Lucky Heart has moved recently, but they were located for several years, kind of catty-cornered to the Lorraine Motel. And the owners of Lucky Heart were very instrumental in helping establishing the National Civil Rights Museum there at the Lorraine. This is a downtown mural that's been around for several years, thanking Lucky Heart there in Memphis. One of the fascinating aspects about Memphis hoodoo history is the appearance of some of the New Orleans spiritualist churches. New Orleans spiritualist churches were combining elements of traditional African spirituality with, in some cases, Pentecostalism, in some cases, Catholicism. And so we would see groups like, from 1913, like the Eternal Life Christian Spiritualist Association out of Chicago. And they actually opened a chapter in Memphis. And we saw lineage from the late, great Mother Catherine Seals, who had the Temple of Innocent Blood in New Orleans. And it was interesting, we would see Seals, one of her associates, Reverend Alberta Price Bennett, came to Memphis and started a new branch of the Eternal Life Church. And Memphis also had a number of different New Orleans-based spiritualist churches, from the St. Joseph Spiritual Temple to the Divine Temple of Healing in Memphis. In the hoodoo culture, Memphis had some specific artifacts that many practitioners and many academics point to as being sort of Memphis-based in inspiration. One of them is an object known as the nation sack. Now, in some cases, you'll hear this referred to as the nature sack. This was found, mentioned in the Delta around 1948 in some historical record. But from practitioners I've talked to, they would tell me that their grandmother would have one of these sacks, this nation sack, and it might contain roots, snuff boxes, it may contain an egg. They were historically tied to an African women's society in Africa. But the use in Memphis was very, very prolific. Many times they would be referred to as being able to control a man's sexual nature and to basically keep him faithful. And again, this particular object contains some very specific connections to African identity. This is one of the just amazing individuals with a very, very important place in Memphis herbal healings and workings. This is Dr. Charles Champion, and Dr. Champion was the first African-American pharmacist at a retail pharmacy in the Memphis area. Dr. Champion went to school at Xavier in New Orleans, and he learned about the use of roots and herbs. He still runs Champion's Pharmacy, which is not far from Elvis Presley's Graceland area. And Dr. Champion provides different herbal remedies and instructions on caring for your family using specific, legally prescribed herbs and herbs that can be found in the environment. He has many customers that come to see him that may not have access to medical insurance, or maybe there's a financial burden there where they're not able to afford other medicines. And in many cases, I've heard that Dr. Champion's medicines are a lot better than the ones that we could pick up over the counter that have a 2-page warning list. This is Miss Bertha Strickland, known as Big Mama. Miss Strickland was a spiritual healer that lived on Beale Street, and her daughter actually runs a spiritual supply store in Memphis called Memphis Conjure. And Big Mama has a very good reputation in the memories of many Memphians that went to see her for spiritual wisdom and herbal remedies. In 2021, when we mention the word hoodoo, there is a lot of contemporary materials on hoodoo, whether they be books or websites, videos, and there's a lot of focus on tricks and a lot of focus on luck and things like that. The important thing I would want you to take with you is that in regards to Memphis, hoodoo, rootwork, conjure, these spiritual traditions are about survival. They're not. It didn't survive just to do tricks or workings or spells or whatever you want to call it, but it was a means, and is a means for many Memphians of survival, of physical survival, emotional survival, spiritual survival. And like I always tell folks, what New Orleans is to voodoo, Memphis is to hoodoo. Brian, thank you so much for having me.
Tony, that was great. Do you have a few minutes to do a quick Q&A?
I do, sure.
Okay, so a few things immediately came to my mind, and because this is a book fair and a lot of the people who are tuning in come from libraries, museums, other institutions, and also just individuals who have large collections or who are building collections towards having them donated to institutions. I wanted to know, did any of the practitioners of hoodoo write books or pamphlets? Is there a large body of literature from the actual root workers themselves?
It seems to be that the majority of literature was written about the workers themselves. Um, we find that in some situations, record of notes left by practitioners, private writings of where they kept specific list of herbal remedies and things like that. Um, Interestingly, some of the great literature that we've seen came out of some of the writings of the Writers Project with the WLPA back in the day, of where they were going and doing interviews with practitioners, and not necessarily focusing on these traditions, but just doing sort of a um, almost like an ethnography of the life of people in various southern communities, and they just happen to run into individuals that might be using a specific root, or communicating stories about things their grandmothers taught them to do in order to spiritually protect themselves. And so there's some fascinating literature there.
That was,
um,
sorry to interrupt you. That was during the New Deal era.
yes, yes. um, and there's and like I said, a lot of it is incidental. It just happens to show up in the literature, but there's some great instances recorded during that time. So to answer your question, primarily up till now, until we see things like some of the things like some of the writings of like Zora Neale Hurston, who did write on the hoodoo, did write on voodoo, and some of the actual things she experienced and witnessed and was taught. Um, for the majority of literature seems to be from an outsider perspective.
Um, was root work connected to the secret societies in any way? I saw the one gentleman who they called Lieutenant, had the Shriner's hat on.
Well, there were some societies that were operated. In fact, there's some communities where hoodoo is practiced, where there's actual initiations into specific communal societies. Um, we would see individuals who perhaps identified um, as a spiritual healer and also as a member of a fraternity like Freemasonry. And so you would see, practitioners many times live in both realms, I guess. But this wasn't necessarily the standard, but we would see occurrences where this might happen.
Yeah, I remember in your book you also talked about the St. Paul. Was it St. Paul Spiritual Temple?
Yes.
That
Yeah.
was kind of a hand constructed sort of ad hoc assemblage, and had integrated many Masonic elements. And I also have some pamphlets from what I'm told is the first Black Freemason temple in Los Angeles in the 1920s, centered around Central Avenue. So I guess I was just kind of wondering, from seeing that hat and also from reading that part in your book about the St. Paul
Sure.
Temple.
Sure. Well, Doc, at the St. Paul Spiritual Temple, for years, um, uh, local legends and fear mongering had given the place the name Voodoo Village. And if you grew up around Memphis, you did this legend trip on a regular basis, where you would take a girl in high school with you and drive out to, quote, Voodoo Village and honk the horn, and allegedly people would come out and chase after you. And sadly, that ended up resulting into severe vandalism, various attacks on the property, just all sorts of horrible things happening to the family there. When in all actuality, the temple is a area of property that was dedicated to spiritual healing. and very much had a basis in African traditional healing systems and African spiritual traditions. And the family there did utilize some Masonic sacred geometry in the aesthetics of some of the temple, and yeah, it's like I said, the city for years had known it by the insult of Voodoo Village, but it's very much a spiritual temple.
Is it still in existence?
It is, and the family still lives there, and you know it's they keep to themselves, and but the family will tell you on a regular basis. They'll still get visitors almost every night pulling up there this many years later, you know, either yelling or throwing stuff or trying to see inside the property. And but I would like to think here in 2021 we've gotten past some of that, but some of that's still there, unfortunately.
I'm really so grateful, Tony. This was a tremendous presentation, a great interview. You're so articulate and you've done so much great research, and you're a great writer. So I really appreciate you taking part in the fair. And I just want to remind everybody that the fair is September 23rd through 26th. It's at brooklynbookfair.com, and enjoy all the virtual booths. And again, hopefully next year we will be back in our live space, but I'm really grateful that we could have so many guests from around the country and around the world through the virtual fair this year. So maybe it's a blessing, or we can, you know, look at the certain blessings in disguise during the pandemic. And thank you again, Tony.
Thank you for having me.